So welcome everyone to session 2 of 3 that we'll be having to talk about Psalm 23. This is part academic sort of study, but also because of how cherished and beloved this psalm is, it really is an opportunity to reflect on some of our lived experience with this life or with this psalm in our lives. So that's kind of the nature of our conversation. As we get into it today, we're going to be talking mostly about 2 verses. I mean, there's only 6, so we're talking about 3 and 4 today. And really, verse 4 forms the kind of the crux of the entire psalm. Okay, the words, "I will fear no evil because thou art with me." You know, everything that appeared before those words was kind of leading to them, and everything after those words draws on them. That is the crux. I don't have to fear because thou art with me. And there's something else I want to point out that you probably noticed, but maybe you hadn't. And that is that distinct shift from the psalmist talking about he leads me to green pastures, he leads me to the still waters. But now I will fear no evil because thou art with me. And if you notice that, maybe you started to think about it a little bit. And there's, but if not, this is a good opportunity. But there's a wonderful author, Martin Buber, you've probably heard of or maybe read his famous book, I and Thou, but that's really what he reflects on. And one of the things he does is he talks about the difference between theology and religion, where theology is those instructive places where we talk about God, about the things that God does. But religion are those personal encounters with God, those ways that we experience God. So when we talk about God theologically, we say God or he or she, that sort of distance. But notice then it becomes more of a religious experience, more of a deep prayer when he says thou, and what that means. And it just sort of opens it up. And so just as we look over this, as we're talking about it, as you read through it, reflect on that. Notice where those shifts happen, you know, in the psalm itself. And it really does sort of make it more deeply personal, but it plays with that difference. You know, Buber also said that theology is like being given a menu. It helps us understand, it helps instruct us, but religion is eating the meal. It's when you actually can experience it, when you can bring it into yourself and become one with it. So that's kind of what's happening in some of this today. And then the other comment I wanted to have at the beginning here was that there's many translation considerations for this. Not all of them, you know, I will almost use the word bad. It's not bad, but it's just that translation can be confusing. It can lead to a richness, an enrichment of meaning. It can also take away. Well, there's one instance here that it kind of takes away, and that is in the King James and in the Revised Standard Version. There's the line. What verse is it? Is it 3? You lead me on straight paths for his name's sake. That line. That idea of straight paths is an interesting choice because the Hebrew actually conveys this sense of it's roundabout ways that lead us, that end up in the right direction. That's really what the Hebrew is trying to say there. Not straight paths, just at least directly, but the roundabout ways where we get to where we need to be. And why is that important? Well, as we talked about a little bit last week, there are a lot of references in this psalm and in many of the psalms to those quintessential moments in the identity and the history of Israel, the Exodus being a huge one. And so to use that language specifically, those roundabout ways where we end up where we need to be, it is a direct reference to the way that the Israelites were freed from Egypt. And in fact, in Exodus chapter 13, it specifically says that God didn't take them on the shortest route. but they went the circuitous route because of the Philistines maybe, but also because they needed time to really let go of their identity of people enslaved in Egypt and step into the fullness of their reality with God and who God was shaping them to be. And so that translational issue, concern, whatever, it's not that it's wrong. I mean, because ultimately, he leads me in the paths I need to go, because that's where some of the translations go too. But the King James and the New Revised Standards, they focused on straight paths. And the Hebrew really wasn't just saying that. And it opened up, the Hebrew opens up all those reflections on how is it that we grow in our lives? How does God tend to lead God's people, to lead me? And it's not often in those straight paths, getting me right to where I need to go. That's the efficiency we all long for in our lives, or a lot of us do. But that ain't reality. And it also doesn't tend to stick. But it opens up all those reflection points when we consider the Hebrew, and sometimes we miss that. They get hidden in English. Now, that's not always the case. Sometimes, and then actually a little later, we'll talk about an instance where the English translation actually does develop a little bit more what the Hebrew or the psalmist might have been trying to say, but we'll get to that. So I want to start there with a couple reflection points that will, I hope, add to the conversation. And I want to offer now a moment for you to either reflect on anything I just said, or to bring in your own comments about, where you've been going so far as you've studied this material. Jane.
I'm smiling because I like that you talked about this straight paths things, because sometimes we are made to believe or raised in such a way that we are supposed to take the straight and narrow path,
yes,
or we're failing, or it's wrong. And when my husband and I 4 years ago went to Arizona and we're kayaking through these slot canyons on this, the arms of those rivers, and we were we were together in the same kayak. Well, I do not paddle straight. We don't paddle equally, so we're all over. We weave. And we came up with, after hours of kayaking, first in frustration and then in acceptance of the way we were moving, we came to the conviction that you don't have to go through life in a straight line. It's okay to not go through life in a straight line. So I did this, my own personal quote with the picture. It's framed in our house, because I think we need to remember that God's way isn't always, he doesn't always get where we're going in a straight line. We have to learn, we have to grow. There's challenges, and he knows we need to experience them.
Yeah, think of all the stress that has been put maybe on ourselves or on people we know in our lives, because in one way or another, that idea that there's this set path, this straight way to do it. Don't waste time, go for it, get in there, do it. How many of us ended up with a major in college that we sort of went into work directly related to that? Sometimes it happens. And actually, as you look back, you sort of see connections maybe, but a lot of us get to our vocational choices and our family choices through a lot of different twists and turns. So it need not be, but you're right. We really do find a lot of pressure from within and without, as if that's the way we should be doing it. And that's when, if you're doing it right, that's how it goes, and that's, I think it's just, like you said, it just becomes patently false in lived experience. Yes, Marilyn.
This just occurred to me, partly Jane's example, but also thinking about my own life, that one of the reasons our paths, God wouldn't lead us just sort of straight somewhere, is that there are other people's needs too, those around us. So we might be the straightest kayak rower in the world. But if we've got somebody we love with us there in the kayak who isn't, we have to kind of adjust to that. And sometimes I think if I really reflect on it, it's been my adjustments to the needs of other people that have sort of sparked the most growth in me.
Yeah. A, because it's not all about me. B,
Right.
because it's not all about getting there in that one way.
Mhm.
C, because it's about relationship. That's where it's key. That's where the experience of being human is. And
are you listening, Jay?
it's all of us. It's all of us. It's been ingrained so much. It's hard. Even those of us that find ourselves kind of shaking, nodding and resonating, we have our moments, because you know what it is? We all got that button, whether it's a stress button or something that pushes us, and all of a sudden we become ardent and certain, and this is the way. I mean, isn't that part of what we're experiencing as a country now, with all of our mistrust and our challenges of having conversations about things that really matter? So yeah, we all are impacted by it for sure. But I love the way that the Hebrew really sort of lifts up what really is a consistent thread throughout the whole Old and New Testament, that it is never about a linear, straight, quick path. Growth and humanity, it needs to happen differently, like has been said. So any other comments or thoughts on any of this? Yes, Patty, I see you. I was just scrolling. Got a lot of people here today.
You're scanning.
Great.
Well, I think about that the early Christian groupings, one of the things they called themselves was the way. And the way implies that there's a specific way, or at least it does to me. And in our culture right now, there's so much input about what way is the way. And I mean, it's dizzying, the amount of input. And I think about when I went to school, I was taught that there were certain things that were the way, right? This is what you do as a person in school, and this is how you get to where you want to go. And life came in, and life tells us that there's a lot of ways, but some of the essence of Jesus as the incarnation of the way, and perhaps a model for all people, is that his path too wasn't linear. It wasn't one thing or the other. We ramble with him through a lot of stress, and that's a lesson. That's a lesson. And so the way is what you said. It's not exactly clear, and that lack of clarity is an opportunity. In fact, I think lack of clarity is the place where imagination happens.
Yes.
Where we create fantastic new ways. But I also think that it happens with what the other thing you said, that we gather here together, all of us, and we each are contributing to something to the way that isn't just ours, but is ours, not mine, but ours. And that's what body of Christ is to me. We are the body of Christ, and the body of Christ helps me anyway, with the way. It changes things for me.
Sure.
I have to hear you. I love to hear you, because it nourishes me. And I think the disciples got that, even though they were probably as crazy as we are. I mean, we struggle with it.
Yeah. And that's the nature of why community is so important, why spiritual community is important. We are guides, we are sounding boards, we are compassionate hearts, landing places, friends. accountability we provide. There's a lot of different ways that it's important. So yeah, the body of Christ does teach us and shape the way we walk the path, that it isn't a linear path. I mean, do this, and you may have noticed this already, but read any of the Gospels and notice how many of the stories, especially the ones you really remember, are really, they occur as a product of interruption or Jesus being sidetracked. Okay. It is so much about that. And I really resonate with what you said, Patty, that those moments when it's not scripted, when it's not expected, that does spur our imagination, our creativity. It asks us to respond in the moment and not out of our preparation or our plans. Again, having preparation and plans is crucial. And I think it well prepares you to be creative in many instances. But truly the path that we're talking about, whether Old or New Testament, is one that is quite circuitous and characterized by those surprising moments.
Mm-hmm.
Did I see another hand up? Bonnie. You have to unmute still.
Okay, what Patty said sort of jolted something in my brain. Wasn't what I had thought about when I was reading this at all, but what you were talking about, the way and setting goals, and I think when you're a parent, you really is my inclination sometimes is, well, I did it this way, so why aren't you doing it the same way that I did it, because that's the right way, right? I mean, I went to school, I became a nurse, I was a nurse forever. Why are you still trying to make up your mind what you're going to do? Things like that. And you just have to kind of think it's different for everybody. Everybody has a different experience. My daughter was a theater major, and I was forever like, oh my God, she's never going to get a job. And she's still fumbling around. I'm like, well, what did you think? You were going to be, Elizabeth Taylor or some big actress, I mean, you're not, I'm really dating myself, aren't I, when I say Elizabeth Taylor? But anyway.
Not in this crowd.
I should be thinking of somebody more current. But anyway, but it's just, and I only have one daughter. I'm sure if for people that have several children or more than one, they're different. I see our nieces and nephews that are siblings that couldn't be more different. Yeah. Everybody's got their own way of doing things, their own talents, their own strengths, their own weaknesses. And it's that's hard. I think when you were raised up that, well, this is how you do it. This is what we should do. You have 2.5 kids per family kind of thing, and you go to high school, you go to college, you get married, you have kids, you have a good job, you retire, I mean, that's sort of the path.
Yes.
And it's not like that for everyone. And that's just broad. Then when you get down to like the spiritual realm and people's beliefs, it even varies more, I think.
It's so true. Thank you for your honesty there. I saw a lot of us smiling. I think we've had many of those feelings, those conversations, and many of us have lived through that. And one thing I just note is that I remember as a kid when my parents expressed some hesitancy of me doing liberal arts because it doesn't necessarily lead directly to, a specific field. I wouldn't say they ever were pulling their hair out, but they just said, be careful when you do, because but I remember within myself not feeling that sort of worry or stress. I was just like, no, but I'm learning how to learn. And I feel like it's going to be a lot of skills and I just trust where it's going. So my lived experience was so different than their worry. And I have to bring myself back to that place now that I'm a parent and seeing that tendency sometimes in myself that I want to come up and say, no, don't do that. Whatever it is that we do to protect instead of trust, because I often project those feelings of fear onto my kids when their lived experience is quite different. They're going through life and they're being fully themselves. And that really is where I try to focus, to help that happen, not to create more obstacles. But it's hard. I mean, that's why we're all nodding. We all know these conversations and feelings.
Thank you.
Horty, and then Marilyn.
Maybe this is tattling, but
We might have to mute you.
there was not a lot of negotiation in my family of origin about almost anything. And the example that just comes to my mind right now is my mother would correct people's grammar in the grocery store.
Oh, my goodness.
I believe you mean whom.
What was that one? Believe you me?
I believe you mean whom.
Oh, I believe you mean whom. Oh, yeah. That's
Oh, dear.
everybody loves that. Marilyn, did you want to say something too?
Yes, I did, because I think maybe some of you know that I have a PhD, and you could imagine that perhaps I went on a real straight path getting there. When I was a senior in college, getting ready to graduate, I went to see my advisor, and he said, Marilyn, you could go to graduate school. And I thought to myself, why would I want to do that? So there were some ways in which the fact that my life took such a different direction that in my late 30s than I ever pictured at sort of the appropriate age, I think it helped me not get too upset with choices that my daughters were making that maybe I thought over the long run that might not be the best choice. And actually it's turned out, I mean, they have wonderful lives and wonderful jobs that they have created themselves. I'm very proud of them, but I could just sort of accept the fact that they weren't going to major in accounting or something.
Eventually, I mean, maybe it takes a long time to let that go, but eventually we do have to come to some form of acceptance there when we recognize, and then you look back and you're like, wow, I really tried to control or tried to make that path straight or focused on it that way as if it was supposed to happen that way when I did not need to, kind of energetically try to manipulate that way. And also it doesn't tend to create more relationship. It actually tends to create more fracture. So it's just, but that's how we learn it, right? I think the process of letting go is just as circuitous.
Well, I just think that it was easier for me to do because of my own experience.
Yeah.
The fact that when I was graduating from college, I thought, ooh, I wouldn't want to go to graduate school.
Right.
When I end up getting a PhD. But a bunch of things happened in between.
Yes. Yes. All right, Bob.
Well, I don't necessarily think that parental guidance is all that misdirection. I mean, even though you might not go the way your parents want you to, they still have the influence on you, no matter what path you take.
Oh, of course. Absolutely. Yeah. The guidance is important. It's just the nature of it and the way we as parents, what we tend to focus on, and then looking back as to, wow, look at that. Look at the way things turned out, and where were my efforts kind of helping that? Where was I focusing on certain other things that were less crucial? Where was I operating out of fear versus faith, trust? And this isn't to judge. Absolutely not. That's it. That's why it's about acceptance, because we all we walk the path the way we know how, and to the best of our ability, and hopefully in community, with others that can help us. But it is not, it doesn't end up working out, the way we often envision. And so it takes a lot of forgiveness and a lot of acceptance, but that's a beautiful thing. That's deep learning. How many of us go through our whole lives struggling to accept forgiveness because we've never been taught that it's okay to make a mistake? Because we've been forced to this idea that there's this one way to do things. So we have to do it, the straight path. And if you get off the path, you're doing it wrong. That's a reality for so many. and it makes us hard in our lives. It makes us brittle. It makes us hard of heart. It makes us like Pharaoh. So it's just, there's a lot of that can come up. So, you know, you never know where these conversations are going to bloom to. So this is it's a great opening conversation here, which all relates to the ways that this psalm touches us, because it touches so many different facets of our lives. Unless there's someone else that had something they would like to add, I'd like to move into the reading then of the next portion. In fact, let's just read the first 4 verses because it's so short. I have it right here. So let's just read it all together. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. That's a different one. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. All right, so this one says paths of righteousness. When you look at that C, and you'll see that it's often straight paths. There's a couple other ones too, but that's an area of contention. That's why, as far as what the Hebrew means or what it's trying to convey in English. So beautiful language. And you could see there, since we were talking about it, that shift that happens right from the he to the thou, thy language. It's really powerful. But let's start first with that opening line there where it talks about he restores my soul. You know, what comes to mind when you hear that passage? And even what do you reflect on when you think about what is a soul? It's one of those things that often speaks to us here, and we're like, yes, we feel something, but it's not always as clear. And maybe that's a good thing, but how to articulate it. What is this that we're referring to? You know, so just speak to what comes up for you when you hear he restores my soul. Bob?
Well, before this class, I looked in the dictionary under the word soul, and something that jumped out at me, and which I was already considering, was spirit.
Yeah, okay. So the spirit that is sort of different than, or maybe distinct from a body, a physical body, perhaps. Something a little different. Okay, that's a start. Good to start with dictionaries. Nothing wrong at all with dictionaries, okay? You all remember what a dictionary, well, you all do, of course, but yeah, that's not a bad place to start. Margaret, I saw your hand and I saw a couple others. But...
Well, my soul, I feel it when I sing. Then my heart, my soul, my Savior, my God, to thee. That's what I feel inside of me.
Yeah, see, there's an experience that we can all relate to, and yet I don't know if I could articulate it. You know, that feeling when you do something like singing that connects us both to one another, to our own heart. So not both, but it connects us to one another, to our heart, to our sense of God, to the divine. There's something that's happening there. And maybe that place of interconnection we could call soul. Or maybe it's something different. You know, we feel it, but it's hard to really articulate it sometimes. But that was a big yes, you know, when you talked about singing. Anyone else? What is it about? When you see he restores my soul, what comes up? What is soul? Boyce, and then Patty.
It is like when you are really worried about something or anxious about something that's coming up, and you just go, and and it
Aha.
just releases that tension. And you take a moment and say, oh, why am I worried about this? It's all going to be okay.
Beautiful. So the experience of soul happens with that exhale, which itself happens when we stop. That's often what happens when we stop, especially stop after maybe running around or banging our head against the wall or something. There's an experience there where it's just like, it could be a frustrated ha. It also could just be a resigned, sigh. It could be a sigh of relief, of humility, but it's a welcoming in of something new. To breathe out, then to welcome in that new breath, that new spirit, perhaps.
To me, it's a recentering of your harmony.
Yeah, it's certainly the beginning of that. Absolutely. Thank you. Patty? Unmute.
One of the pieces for me in soul is a renewing of the capacity for wonder, because I think little kids have wonder, and wonder has to do with being present to all that's coming in that's amazing. And I think that I get cluttered up with all that's coming in that isn't amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And then I want to have this path that I want to have. But like you said, Boyce, if I can let that go and just be present, then the capacity for wonder can occur. And that's a place where I get open. And I think that's the place for me where soul gets opened.
Yeah, I love that. One of the things when I was reflecting on this, I was thinking, the soul is what enables us to be human beings rather than human doings. And there's a story that I found that had to do with this sort of safari, these tourists traveling in Africa on a safari, and they hired these native porters to carry their stuff. And so they had been going for 3 days, the porters carrying all their things. And after the third day, the native porters said, we're going to take a day off, a day to rest. And the tourists were like, well, why? We just got started. And they said, well, it's not because we're tired or anything, but we've been traveling so fast and so far, we need to let our souls catch up to us. And it's sort of like one of those things that can, in our mindset, that feels like what? But there's a wisdom there. There's that welcoming in of something more than just the going. And that is really such an important part of our humanity, isn't it? That ability to stop, that we're not just robots. I mean, the problem is we live in a society that values us for our production oftentimes and assigns that sort of value and puts pressure on us. But the truth is, our deepest life is experienced through all the richness that we often don't take the time to welcome in. So it's those moments like Boyce named, where we just exhale, stop, allow it to be restored. A lot of us, we've been struggling with our souls lately, haven't we? Mm-hmm. As individuals, and many would say our country right now is struggling with its sense of soul and and who we are right now. It's a coming back to ourselves. The soul is that part of us that's deeper than the day-to-day spinning the wheel, spinning around. Horty?
I liked the image of your crossroads when you talked about the parts of us that really do collect. And I think of my soul as being the absolute inner depth of myself. And that it is the intersection of all the infinite parts that are available and possible, that have been, that will be. And the word that comes up for me as Boyce is talking about release, and as we're mentioning other things, it's the place from which I allow, rather than force but just allow. How often do we're so tense we can't allow? And it's a place of trust. It's a place of faith. It's a place of allowing what I may become.
If you have an active prayer life or a meditation practice, one of the things you'll find is that time that you take enables much of that process you just named, Horty. And if it's been a struggle for you to create that practice, and it's a struggle for many of us, then know that that's what it's teaching, is that the act of prayer, the act of taking that time to meditate, is that act of allowing, of recognizing that my life is not simply dependent on my efforts, my control, but it's about welcoming in that greater spirit that has always supported us, and recognizing that and practicing gratitude for it ultimately. But it's only when it is a practice, and we can find ourselves out of practice, out of balance, and then we misplace our sense of self, our very humanity. And this psalmist is telling us that where do we go to restore that? We go to the shepherd, we go to God. God restores that. Our job is to take the time to receive it. Not going to be forced on us, but to take the time to receive it, because it's there by the still waters, in the green pastures, in the places, even in the dark valleys. Other comments on soul? Carol. Unmute. Let me see if I can help you out. I'm going to see if I can unmute all. I don't know. It's not letting me. I don't know why it does that. It should allow me to unmute all of you. And then mute all. But anyway.
And then watch out.
Yeah. It doesn't work when you hit the space bar and hold it down. No, it doesn't. Oh, I'm sorry.
Carol, click on the microphone in the lower left corner.
Okay, she's going to write it. I think she might be. So I'll keep an eye on you. Sorry that that's happened, Carol. If it does change, please do feel free to jump in. Hold it lower. Screen frozen. Oh, okay. Well, we see you moving.
Well, she can come in here because I can unmute.
Oh, yeah. I got Jay. Yep. See you in a second. Oh, maybe some of you read that, a lot of us, our souls have been impacted in a variety of ways over the last year. Certainly the slowness of time at the beginning enabled, I think a form of refreshment for many people. But then it's also gotten hard for our souls over the past year and months and weeks. And I read an article about an ER nurse that's experiencing what she calls compassion fatigue, where it's very, very difficult. And it's very, very painful for folks. And she's referring to the numbers of people she's seeing come in sick. And in her case, it had to do with vaccination and that frustration that she feels as a doctor or as a nurse in regards to that. But look, any of us have been a long-term caregiver or have had someone that we love in our lives that we want, that just will not advocate for their own well-being or their own health. They won't make changes in their lives. Even in our relationships, those people that we love that don't love us back and we still keep going back to them, we can experience different levels of compassion fatigue. And that in itself is kind of, it can damage our soul, our sense of who we really are, because it can pull us back into that place of shutting off. And what is, compassion is such a central part of humanity, of what makes us human. It's that connection. And when we shut that off, we become more isolated, and it just becomes, we see what the results of that are. I'm sorry for that big interjection there, Carol. I mostly was doing it because I wasn't sure how long it would take you to get to the other room. But here you are.
Well, Jay says you know what he looks like, so. No, what I was going to say was a lead in after what you said, Dan, was I've been trying to follow your recommendation of reading the New Testament over the summer.
Yep.
And I had one instance where suddenly I got so immersed in the reading, I lost all sense of time, and I was just really engaged in what I was doing. And I wish I could have more times like that, because I find myself sometimes, what did I just read? Or, oh my gosh, look at it's 3 o'clock already, and I wish I could have more time to let my soul get immersed the way I did for those. I don't even know how long I was reading, but I wish I could get more time like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, there is a way. There is a way. But it's not a guarantee either, but by putting yourself in that moment, it gives you the opportunity, because you're right. Those are magic moments. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes when we get lost in something, be it a book or a movie or a view somewhere, or in a moment with someone we love, those are precious, but we can't orchestrate that. We just put ourselves in the path of it possibly happening, and be ready to receive it when it does. And that is a practice, isn't it? That's where it comes from. So the more we practice sort of keeping our senses and our perception and our spirit supple, keep that sponge wet, we'll be more attuned to it, because it's beautiful. Thank you. Horty?
In my, I was going to say in my earlier hippie days, but I'll just say at a time of my different kinds of learning.
Your hippiness.
A man who was profoundly influential to me was Richard Alpert, who then became known as Ram Dass. And he pursued some of the teachings of the East, and the man who was very influential in his life, I find very quotable lots of times. And I remember this one a great deal. On the joy of seeing a long absent friend, stay with the joy. And how often, whether it's the joy of a meal, the joy of a drink of water, the joy of seeing a friend long absent, seeing your home when you've been gone for a while. Okay, there it is. Now, what's next?
Yep.
What's for dessert? What are my friend and I going to do? Gosh, it's been so long since I've seen you that blah, 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 blah. Stay with the joy.
Yeah.
Stay with the joy. And I love your word continuing to talk about the word practice. It is practice, because we have to do it again and again and again and again and again. It's the practice of staying present in that place of allowing our soul to be refreshed and replenished. And I think that is a place of real joy.
Yeah. And it takes a lifetime. I think often you reach a certain age and it gets a little easier. I'll always remember my dad's mom, my grandmother, who I wasn't super close with, because she was the kind of person on the phone, when you talk to her, it would be like, well, how you doing? How's it going? Okay. All right. Well, bye. She just didn't want to have, we never really had long conversations. But I tell you, when she'd come visit, she would sit there in the corner with this smile and a misty look in her eye that conveyed to me what you just said, that she just wanted to be in the joy of that moment of witnessing and being together and experiencing something that was so beautiful and sweet to her, so simple, but staying in it. She wouldn't ever say, oh, no, let's not ruin this. But just that smile, it would just stay on her face the whole time. And it communicated, I want to stay here for a while. I want to be in this place. And I'll always remember that, because that's the message that she gave me. It's like, wow, I don't need to rush through this. Now, it didn't change me as a kid. I often was like, okay, what's next? Like my sons do. That was great. Now what's for dessert? Okay, now what are we going to watch? It's all that next thing. Part of that's an enthusiasm for life. But what we also need to teach is a slowing down, that wisdom part that we lose touch with, partly because we don't share the stories, we don't take the time in the way that sometimes we used to, or that maybe we will after we go through, the process of learning and bumping our heads against the wall and then realizing, okay, yeah, it's different than I thought. But
and Dan,
yeah, go ahead.
That happens for me when you ask us in church to stand up and turn around and just appreciate who's there.
Yeah.
And it may not be the time of, we used to wander around in the aisles, but just taking in, this is the community of my heart. This is where my soul gets restored, in reminding myself of the conversations that I've had with people, the conversations we've had in this gathering. My soul is restored in looking out over my congregation, those that congregate with me in like thought. And I appreciate you giving us that opportunity.
Thank you. Yeah, it's important in whatever ways we can to see one another, to really take that in. All right, can we move on to the next? We've really talked a lot about soul here, and it's beautiful. There's a lot to reflect on here in these brief passages. But the next thing I want to ask you about is in the next line, where in this reading it said paths of righteousness, but whether it's straight paths or just the paths, the specific language is we're led that way for God's name's sake. And that's kind of means for God's reputation. Okay. Why does it appear that God needs to get the credit for those places that we are led and the paths that we are led down? What is it? And especially if we consider that, once again, this might be touching on the Exodus event when they were led by the paths, the path of to freedom by God in the way that God did it. What is it? Why is that important? Why do you think it's important to give God the credit? And that's a lot to chew on. When you think about the moment before the freeing of the slaves, there's that famous story about the 10 plagues, and where Pharaoh would be approached and he'd be told that you could free these slaves, let them go. And he would say, yes, I will. And then he would not do it because of his hardness of heart. And there's some challenging language in there actually before the story where it says God will harden his heart and then basically punish him for it. And when you read the actual story, it's in the first 5 plagues where Pharaoh has these constant opportunities to let the slaves go. It is he that hardens his heart. The last 5 plagues or so, God is hardening his heart. And it's the implication that when we practice hardening our hearts, then things will move in a direction where that is what continues. We become what we practice. That's sort of it's a relationship there. It's not God just punishing in that sense. But the point is, maybe, what if Pharaoh after the first plague had said, you know what, go free. You're fine. You get out of here. How would that have changed our sense of this whole story? If it wasn't really about God freeing them, if it was about Pharaoh and his decision, it feels a little less solid, feels a little less hopeful, that it's sort of about the whim of a human decision. Bob, did you want to say something?
My father used to say, without religion, there are no morals.
Yeah, well, that's part of the, that's also another one of those reflection points about, having a soul means that we have a moral agency as human beings. And certainly religion and religious community help to shape that morality. There's a sacred component to history in the Bible, that God is on the side of goodness and on the side of justice. And so this story shapes it to be that it is God that motivates this despite all human interference. It makes it larger, than the circumstances. Many people back in the Civil War said, well, slavery would have faded out anyway because there's a point where it was becoming less economically viable. And that may well be true, at least in part. But if we didn't stand up against it morally, if we didn't sort of identify that sort of spiritual component to destroy it, then why couldn't it have been that, well, the economic conditions made it unviable at that point, but what about later when the economic conditions change? Would slavery become justifiable again? See, when God's involved, it becomes more of a statement, more of a permanency. God is above the whims of humanity. God is above the shifting sands of economics. Okay, so the whole way of saying, for God's name's sake, God's reputation is the one who saves, the one who leads, the one who frees. And that does matter because it's not about us being those people. We participate in it, but it's motivated by God. That is fundamental to God's identity. It's not this sort of Zeus-like, in the Greek mythology, Zeus had this huge ego and needed to get all the credit for things. No. It's not about that. God is not expressing ego here. I just think that it lends a weight, a gravitas to the whole arc of history, that we can trust in that God will be there for us. That's part of who God is. Patty?
So I'm not sure of what I'm going to say, but for me, God represents a kind of underlying moral order. And moral is such a loaded word. It's not even moral, it's more integrity. There's an integrity in it, a foundation that is ultimately works, and I miss it often when I get too busy. We as a country miss it because we get too involved. But to me, it has to do with the ideas of oneness and interdependence, and the things that Jesus was trying to teach us, that we need to help one another, that it's not about individual right only, it's also about community and the balance of that. And somehow there's an ultimate integrity that comes from God for me. And it's something that I can see sometimes and can't see sometimes.
Yeah. Thank you. Beautifully said. And you're in good company when you say you're not sure what you're about to say. I think that's some of the best stuff that comes out. It's kind of like those moments we were talking about before, when they're just sort of just got to jump into the creativity, the imagination part of it. So thank you. Boyce and then Marilyn.
To me, it seems like this whole psalm is about uplifting God and showing who God is and the relationship between us and God.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that all of us have degrees of controllingness, if that's the word. We like to control our lives. And to me, this is kind of saying, God is the one who gives the direction. I follow it, following God's direction. I'm giving up my controlling. Give up your controlling and listen to God and let God lead you, and you'll get to where you need to be.
Yes.
And I think that's a thing that we all fight. We've been told for a long time, going to church, give your life to God, and we don't. You know, we have trouble giving our life to something we can't see, something we think is there, and we can't hear, but yet we sometimes have thoughts. And so it's this controllingness within us that holds us back, and we need to allow that to go.
And, you know, for a lot of us, it's not that we don't give ourselves to God. It's that we do until we don't. Because we often find ourselves doing it in the moments that are easy or when things are going well. You know, we sort of make those associations, and all of a sudden something happens. And for each one of us, it can be different. That jolts us, that jars our sense of faith and connection. And then we often find ourselves wanting to get into that control zone again. We all get pushed in those different ways. And that's part of the joy of discovering how to practice this psalm. Because those are the moments, those are the dark valleys, you know, that where we need to really say, okay, this is where the practice really begins. Marilyn?
I have been, ever since last Sunday, really thinking a lot about the sermon and thinking about sort of what really guides us if we want to follow God, to be led by God, are those two laws: loving God with everything that we are and our neighbors as ourselves. And I think that, of course, what Jesus had to say came way after this psalm was written. But it seems to me that there's, if you're going to be doing it in God's name, or you're being led, that for me, thinking about those two overarching laws, just I find it a very exciting, wonderful thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it simplifies it, gets it down to brass tacks, and gives us something on which to focus in those times where we might be wobbling or feeling, you know, that we've been knocked down a bit. Bonnie?
Two things are crossing my mind as I'm listening. One is the children of Israel wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. Was that God leading them around for 40 years? Why were they out there for 40 years? You know, and I think of things like the golden calf and these different things that they did that sort of got them off on the sidetrack, and they're still wandering around out there. And then I also think about the shepherd and the sheep. And without the shepherd, where would the sheep go? What path would they be on? And the shepherd has his staff, and he can kind of guide them and bring them back in when they start wandering the wrong direction. And so I don't know, those are the two sort of symbols that I'm relating to right now.
Yeah, one way or another, the 40 years is likely a symbolic number. 40 is a very symbolic number in the tradition. But one way or another, it wasn't a quick trip. And when the time was complete, they finished the journey. And that's kind of what it comes down to. When it was complete, when it was done, they were ready to enter into the promised land. It was not according to their schedule. So it's just, this is what we have been talking about. We are often faced with that. And some of us, when it's not according to our schedule, we kick against the pricks, we resist, we dig our heels in. Other times and other people will respond differently. Most of us respond both ways. At different times in our lives, we respond one way and then the other. It depends on where we are and what's been happening. You know, there's a lot of that too. But yeah, this is a lot about that sort of recognizing that we are, in a sense, wandering. So wherein is our guidance? Wherein is that reconnection with our soul? Wherein is our trust? What do we trust in? This psalm in 6 verses kind of keeps pulling us back to who we are and whose we are. And that's why it's so comforting. That's why it's so endearing. Did I miss someone? Did someone else have their hand up? Patty?
I just wanted to make a comment about the phrase "for his namesake." And I think that this is a phrase that was written by a person trying to make a comment about God. For me, it triggers ideas of hierarchy. I think that for me, I have to look at when I'm embedded in a culture and it influences how I say things. I may say things that are reflective of the way I'm embedded rather than the way God is. And so if I hear the word "for his namesake," it's not so much, for me, it's not so much a hierarchy, but because God is.
Yeah.
But it's easy for me to get trapped in the idea of hierarchy. I mean, I have to deal with the conflict of that.
Sure.
And understand God as he doesn't need it for his namesake.
Right.
It is because God is.
Right.
Because it's of the I am.
Right. No, it's not a statement, or I don't believe it's a statement that God is asking for us to glorify God because of how great God is for leading us on these straight paths. But as you're saying, it is God's nature. It is God's identity to do that, to be that freeing, liberating, loving, guiding God is just simply endemic to who God always has been. And so we claim that, and it's important to claim that, because then these big moments where disappointment happen can become moments of trust instead of, oh no, we don't know now what's going to happen because we're at the whim of human decision making. No, we have a larger sense of someone who is with us, who is for us through these times. Okay. And that's an important thing, right? Because we say this a lot, so I'm not going to harp on this or anything, but it's through the valley, right? It's not to avoid the valley. It's not skirting the valley. No, God goes with us through the valley. We're not protected from suffering. We will get hurt. We will get sick. We will die. Loved ones will die. Injustice happens. That sort of thing. But God does not leave us in those moments. God is with us in those moments. And that is something in which we can take comfort. This psalm is really trying to hold us through that. It doesn't shy away. It's not pretending that this is an easy path, What about this one? The English translation in many of them, I know it started with the King James, where it says, "through the valley of the shadow of death," is not actually what the original Hebrew says. Well, scholars agree that it's not, because there's a simple thing that happened. The original Hebrew word is salamut, one word, and it means dark valley or deep dark valley. And the King James translators looked at that and they saw 2 words. Now, this is the challenge in a biblical Hebrew because there's no vowel markers. Okay, so you just have these consonants. So either of them could have been right. They're trying to judge based on context. So they took a word that might have been salamut and they made it, sal mavet. Not that much different. But what that one means when they made it into 2 words is valley of the shadow of death. Now, I would contend, like many, that the English translation may well tap into some more of the richness of what the Hebrew psalmist was trying to convey. But I want to ask you, how does that? What is the sense that through the valley of the shadow of death offers to you? Is that helpful? How does it enrich your understanding of those moments with God? Does it change it? What is the valley of the shadow of death? Jane?
You know, because my earlier upbringing was the translation Valley of the Shadow of Death, I always thought of it in terms of death, the dying process and all that. But in, more recent years, 10 years or more, I have a translation that says in the dark valley. And to me, it is a dark valley. I think of it is much richer for me just to think of it in terms of God is with us through the dark valleys.
Okay.
And that can be any day, any tough situation or challenging situation. So it is, for me, it's better just to be a dark valley rather than death.
Okay. I invite you to think back, not you, Jane, just all of you, to think back to the story of creation in Genesis, when the trees are planted, the tree of life, the trees of good and evil, knowledge of good and evil. And the interaction that happens there is when they eat of that particular tree, God tells them, now dying, you will die. You are now mortal. You are now aware of your mortality. And so part of being human is that we live our lives in the shadow of death, knowing that we will die. As kids, we don't really appreciate that, but there's a point. Maybe we go through a tragedy. Maybe we lose someone we love. Maybe something happens, and at an early age or at a later age, but at some age, we become aware of that. We live in that shadow all the time. So that's part of the human condition, that awareness. And you know what? That's not a bad thing. I love the ancient Greek mythology stories that talk about how the gods envied the humans, envied the mortals, because when you have a limited amount of time, the decisions you make in your life matter. When you're immortal, what does it matter when you do anything or that you do anything? Because it's just going to keep going on and on. You see what I mean? There's an importance to the fact that we have a certain amount of time. So living with that awareness on some level, not to like, necessarily cower from it, but it's just there, isn't it? It's mortality. That's the shadow. That's the shadow of death, that's a part of life. And in many cultures, they're better at sort of speaking about that and embracing that than others. And we live in a culture that can be, it can do well, and then it can avoid death at all costs. I think it depends on our families, our upbringings, but we often shy away from it. But living in that awareness, and I tell you, when I worked as a hospice chaplain, and you're in that, there was something profound and life-giving that happened when people lived in that space of deeper acceptance of their own mortality. Something that happened about the preciousness of each day. So anyway, I'd like to say that, but I hear you too, in terms of just that the general sense of the dark valleys, that it's not just about those moments when we're aware of death, but all the darkness, all the hard places, God is there. Horty?
You've often talked about the more poetic interpretation that can come from the Hebrew than from the English. In the English, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, for me, never meant that was exactly where I had to be. But even there, and that was the worst thing I could think of. The worst thing I could think of, maybe not was even dying, but the valley of the shadow of death, that umbrelate kind of experience, though I'm there. So that's the worst thing. I remember as a kid thinking that's the worst thing I can imagine. And if he's there with me in the worst that I can imagine, then there's no time that he's not.
Right.
And so the poetry there took me to that place of not being able to think of anything that could be any worse. And therefore he was always with me.
Yeah. And I love that one word, through. It's a movement. It's part of, the journey. but it's not the place of destination. It's not the final word. And then that's a deep trust there, because I know we've all been in valleys that it does feel like more of a destination, but it's that through those dark places, I need not fear. And again, the fear is not, it's not this sense of, I'm going to be, I'm free from harm, I can't be hurt. No, it's not that. It's not that. But it's that sense of trust that through all things, through the pain, through the struggle, we're not alone. And that dark valley simply does not have the final word. That God is there with us. God is for us. God is acting for us. That's powerful.
And a real active word for me was though. Though I walk through the valley. Oh, even there. Oh,
yes.
Really? Even though? Oh, you mean that's not accepted?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's included.
And you're dealing with a time where there were still many people that felt that, it was that whole maybe the early health and wealth type gospel, where it's like, well, if things are going well in your life, it means you're blessed. And if things are not going well in your life, or if you're dealing with sickness and illness and all that, it means you're cursed, that God is away from you. There's a lot of that informed some of the, kind of ancient understanding that a lot of these scriptures attempt to speak against. Or to say, it's not that our condition does not change God. The presence of God is there with us through all things. And it's an important statement. Patty, and then Bob.
I think of the fact that we have a still speaking God. And if God is still speaking to us, it's likely that some of the things that we experience are going to have to die, especially things we're attached to. And so the valley of the shadow of death may be a valley. I mean, death is not necessarily bad. There's a whole concept of life, death, life, that out of death comes life.
That's the Easter story, sure.
Yeah. And so with this still speaking God that comes to us through the body of Christ, as it informs us, that which I'm attached to may have to die, and it may be really a hard thing to give up. Mm-hmm. I know my late husband and I were married 2.5 years before he died, and I was really ticked at God that I had this man I was really loving, and he got cancer. And that was a real teaching for me, that to walk through that valley, and not only to have Michael's death, but to really ask God, what in the heck was happening here, that I had this wonderful experience. I thought of it when you talked about preparing your vows, because we did too, and then have it be gone so fast. Yeah. And there was a great teaching out of that, just a one that brought my soul back together after a long time.
Yeah. But that can rend the soul for a time too. And mm-hmm. It does, it pulls us apart. And I think that's an important part of it too, to allow ourselves to be in the valley, mm-hmm. not to rush through it. And I don't know that any of us can say what that actually looks like, but that there is movement, even if it's movement at a trickle, through these places, that we continue to move as best we can, because it's kind of like, when you put yourself a lot of like grief therapy in situations like that, when you lose a loved one, there's often a practice of what do you think, what if it had been you that died first? What would be the message that you'd want to convey to your loved ones who remain? And invariably we say things like, oh my gosh, I'd want them to know how much I love them and how much I want them to live a full life. Go and live, savor today. And then it's about, well, maybe it's time to take our own advice. So sometimes when we get stuck in those places, it's because we just feel unready, unwilling, unable to move through. And I say this tenderly, to move on, not to forget, but to move on in that place of living. And we've all known people in our lives who seemed maybe never able to get through that. And it's not to judge them, but it's to say that happens. We get stuck in the valley sometimes. And yet it is our call as individuals on the path and as a community on the path to help, to guide, to put a hand out that we might go through this so that life can be found on the other side. It's not an easy path, obviously, but it's part of why we do what we do. And when we do that, I find that's where the deepest humanity is often found. Not to rush people through it, but to be with people, with each other in our pain and our grief. It's so healing, so soul fulfilling to do that. Is it Marilyn? Did I see Marilyn? And then Bonnie?
No, not this
time. Oh, not Marilyn? Okay. Then Bonnie. Oh, and then Bob. Sorry if I got the order mixed up. I might have said it, but go ahead, Bonnie.
This is personal. I find myself feeling very angry. And I feel angry because when I was in the Army, I worked on the pediatric ward, and I worked with a lot of kids that had cancer, and a lot of them didn't make it. Now, some of them today probably would have treatments improved and so forth. I could not deal with that.
Yeah.
I was not, prior to that, I had worked in the operating room when I first started out. Well, that was a patch them up, fix them out, make them better. You know, we only had a couple of times where maybe somebody died, and that was usually a result of car accident coming in, gunshot wound, something, but usually was routine stuff when we were making them better. And I was all about making people better.
Sure.
And then I got into pediatrics, and these kids were getting leukemia, different kinds of leukemia. And this was like in the late 70s, and they weren't making it. They'd make them for a little while, you know, but they'd come back. And we had a lot of kids. I was in Honolulu. We had a lot of kids flown in from Southeast Asia and various places coming there for treatment. And you'd get to know their families. You get to know them pretty well. And I just felt like I couldn't deal with it. I have a good friend that's an oncology nurse. She's just now retiring. And that's been her thing the whole time, is working with cancer patients. And I was like, I want to make people better. I don't want to help people to die, you know, especially kids. It's one thing if for older people, that's expected, but kids aren't supposed to die. And then my own brother, I mean, he died in 1960. But he was young, and I'm still angry to now. Like, damn it, you know, why did that have to happen? You know, he had a young wife, he had two young kids, and he gets cancer and dies. And just the unfairness of it all, and we all know life isn't fair. But there are certain things about when you start talking about death. I remember taking a death and dying class when I was in college. But there are certain things that I still have a hard time accepting.
Yeah.
You know, I know as people get older and they get cancer or something else happens, and it's kind of like, well, maybe I was hoping I'd have another 10 years or whatever, but you kind of, well, it's expected. We all know we're not going to live, you know, forever. But when it comes into some of these other areas where it's young people, then I still have a hard time accepting it. I know that it happens. It's going to always happen. There's going to be something. We're not going to cure everything, and there's always going to be accidents and, you know, things that happen. And yet, I don't know how you really get people through that. I don't know that people ever get through that. I know their lives are never the same. And I hear people talk about, you know, continuing grief. A friend of mine's son was killed in Afghanistan, and I mean, might have been Iraq. I don't remember now. I should know, because it's been a while. I think it was Iraq. Well, she's a Gold Star mom now, and so she has set up this place of respite for Gold Star families, and she's, you know, she had to make some sense out of her son's death, and she's doing a lot. with other Gold Star, families, and helping them get through and sharing their experiences and so forth. I think a lot of people have to make some sense out of it and kind of go that route to do something. But still, I mean, in that way, maybe you can say good comes out of bad, but you just are going to always wish that it never would have happened in the first place.
Mhm.
I don't
I
know.
think it's natural
I still
Mhm.
struggle with it.
Well, thank you for sharing something so personal and for risking that, Bonnie. I mean, one of the things that a psalm like this tries to do is resist that urge that is such a deep part of us to make sense or to explain, because that doesn't always, there isn't always a way to explain it, or at least a satisfying one. But what it's trying to teach us, and again, this is one of those lessons that takes a long time to learn, but when we accept that life and death are one and the same, that it is real, that it is constantly sort of swirling, and it's not something to be afraid of, but it just is, then our relationship to one another can shift, and to God can shift. And then it's not God up there orchestrating who lives and who dies, like a manipulator of puppets, but that we with God can be agents of the healing through the loss, through the pain. And sometimes the healing isn't a cure. Many times it's not. And I would say that you did deal with it. Anger is one of the ways we do deal with it, Bonnie, and you did do it. You found some sort of strength in the moment. And I know it's not complete yet. There's still more maybe that needs to come. But the sharing, what you just did, I feel like is one of the ways that we do just that, and give ourselves a chance, by unearthing, by allowing others to see the pain, that it allows then the stories of others to maybe draw us further out, that we need not hide the anger we feel. We need not hide the frustration, all the ways that we feel how unfair it is, because it is. But the psalm is trying to communicate that it's not only that, and that there's more. If we let it in, there's still yet more, and there's still yet hope. All the pain, all the tragedy, all the bitterness that comes our way, there's still, it's just not the final word. It doesn't, though, leave us in a place where we have the power. It means that, especially when we're used to being in a position, like you said, as a nurse or a doctor, where our job is to take away pain, to bring back to health. That's the task. But ultimately, we're reminded that that's not the realm of our choice always. That we then are often tasked with being, as you said, the ones who shepherd one another through the valley, even if it does mean death. It's one of the hardest things we have to do. And yet, even there, when God is present, when something larger than us is present, it at least leaves open the door of possibility, that there is hope and that there is life to come. And that can keep us going. But I resonate and I honor and I'm thankful for what you just shared out of your story, because I feel that a lot of us know, without necessarily going through the same thing, but we know those places where we have bumped up to similar anger and frustration. Horty?
I like that you help us understand that whatever emotions we're having, fear of death or anger at death or whatever, that's not all there is.
Yeah.
It's okay to be angry and love God. It's okay to not understand and love God. It's okay to feel whatever we're feeling and still know he's holding our hand. The fear, the anger, the confusion, whatever we feel, is not the totality of our destination. It can be a both and. I know when my late husband suicided, I was aware that this was going to be certainly a defining moment in my life, but it would not define who I completely became. And it took a long time to be able to say that. It took a long time, maybe even to try and live into that, because it's a pretty all-encompassing kind of experience. And yet, and it doesn't make it okay. It's not okay that happened. I don't like that that happened. But again, it's both and. My anger, resistance, fear, guilt, all of those things are in addition to my hand being in God's hand, because he extends it to me all the time.
Thank you, Horty. This is, quite a range here today of our conversation. There's more that I had, but I feel like we've covered so much of what this psalm is really about, why it's so crucial, why it's so meaningful to us, for what it can lead us through, but also for just what arises in us, what it touches on, and then just what blooms as we go through it. The act of doing this, type of conversation is simply one more way to make this psalm come alive and to be a part of what its hope is, what its truth is. It is not simply something to read and to ponder, separate from life. No, this is about life. It's about our humanity. It's about our relationship with God, as Boyce and others have said. This is about our relationship with God and who God is through all these things. And we will bump into different times of our lives where we want to reject, or we want to run, or we want to stay in the valley, or we want to turn our back on the sun. The whole idea of a shadow only happens when there's a light source, or in this case, the sun. In a valley, it's the sun that casts the shadows. But sometimes when we experience the shadow, we want to turn our back to the sun. And this psalm is about saying the valley and the shadow are not the sun. They are not the last word. So walk together. Keep going through this. God will guide you. There is the rod and the staff that will help you when you fall, that will do its best to fend off enemies, to protect, not prevent. It's not that God's not trying and doing things that help, but that's the nature of the nudging kind of guidance of God. It doesn't just sort of clear the way like a machete, but like a shepherd. It's never been about preventing all marauders. It's about being a certain way. And the God of the shepherding love is the one that will do anything to lift us up, to hold us, to be by our side through all things. And that's the abiding message, of this psalm, but of the entire tradition, really. The God who loves us through all things. So as we come, and I'll let closing comments be made, but as we come in the next week, we'll see how, that gets wrapped up. and kind of specific ways that the psalmist kind of touches on things that would be very challenging, and that would lead many people to say, God's not with me there, because gosh, when I'm with people that hate me, I mean, is God with me there when I'm going through? The psalmist is trying to reiterate the presence of God is, it just is. Okay. So rest in that. That's a powerful message. And I hope that, is kind of one of the things we receive as we go through. I saw Patty's hand, and then anyone else that wants to say a closing comment.
I just wanted to say something about the word comfort, because, and I was thinking of some of your comments, Bonnie. I always thought, I don't want to be comforted. I want it to be right. And I didn't want Michael to die. But when I hear what we're talking about, the idea of comfort is bigger than the idea of comfort that I have when I try to give comfort. It's more of a transformative experience that is, and it's one that I didn't get, and maybe haven't gotten completely, but you have to have some perspective. You have to get away from where you are with your valley of death emotions to understand that God's kind of comfort is a real big thing.
Yeah.
And it's the kind of love. And I guess it's a statement that isn't made as a statement, that it says you're going to be okay and you're going to get through this. And it doesn't come out that way, but there's some kind of underlying faith that can happen. And maybe when you give comfort to those parents of the leukemic children, that's how you're participating with God, Bonnie. Yeah, I don't know for sure, but that kind of comfort is more comforting to me now than it was before.
Well, I hope you all find your measure of comfort as you consider these things we've talked about, as you experience this psalm and this, there's just this group, just this way that we try to communicate our faith, talk about what's real, talk about the hard places. The more that we cultivate that, the more we are in a position to more deeply walk with each other. And that's where the comforting, that's where the healing happens. When we can be in places where we might share stuff that we haven't maybe ever said before, or said in a long time, or said to certain people. That's important stuff. That's where we walk the walk. And I find that creating these types of opportunities, it makes it way more than just about a Bible study. For anyone that's watching this gets intense. It's like, and I hope that for those watching, that may not have been a part of the group, I still hope that you feel invited in, that as we look over the shoulders, that we feel what's happening as a part of our experience too, not just, wow, look at those people that are talking. No, this is us. This is all of us in the broader sense. And again, that's the joy and the opportunity of doing a conversation like this. So thank you once again for the ways you are so open to it and the ways you help shape it. So I look forward to seeing you next week for our final Psalm 23 session. Be well, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.